For 10 years, the walls of this home held no children's laughter. The halls, though beautiful, echoed only silence. Janet sat on the edge of her bed, her eyes fixed on the small, untouched cradle in the corner. It had been a symbol of hope once, a promise that one day, a baby would lie there. But years had passed, and the cradle remained empty, a cruel reminder of unfulfilled dreams. The weight of time pressed on her shoulders. She had prayed, fasted, and visited doctors. Everything was medically fine, yet, no child. The tick of the clock was loud, each second dragging endlessly. The door creaked open, and John walked in, his tie loosened from a long day at work. He paused, watching his wife. His heart ached at the sight of her sitting there, lost in sorrow. "Janet," he called softly. She looked up, forcing a smile. "You're home early." John sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "Mama Nkechi came by again, didn't she?" Janet looked away. He already knew the answer. "She says I'm barren." Her voice was barely a whisper. John's jaw tightened. "Ignore her. I told you, I don't care what they say." Janet's eyes welled up. "How much longer can we hold on, John?" John lifted her chin, his gaze fierce with love. "As long as it takes." The promise hung in the air, but even love had its limits. Then, 1 month later, everything changed. The doctor smiled as she looked over Janet's test results. "Congratulations, Mrs. Okeke. You're pregnant." The words barely registered before Janet gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. John froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "Pregnant," he echoed, almost afraid to believe it. The doctor nodded. "Yes. And not just one, you're carrying twins." Tears streamed down Janet's face as she turned to John, laughter and sobs mixing. He pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "Thank you, God." At last, their prayers had been answered. The twins arrived, a boy and a girl. A long journey of waiting, of pain, had led to this moment. Their home, once a place of longing, now overflowed with joy. The entire family gathered for a week-long feast. Friends and well-wishers filled their home. Music, dancing, and laughter stretched late into the night. John stood tall at the center of the celebration, his heart swelling with pride. His arms held his children, and his eyes shone with gratitude. Beside him, Jackson clapped, smiling as he leaned close. "You're a lucky man, John." But behind that smile, something else lurked. A darkness waiting for its moment. And in 4 years, that darkness would consume everything. For 4 years, John's life had been picture perfect. The echoes of children's laughter filled his once quiet home. The weight of waiting, the pain of unanswered prayers, had been replaced with joy. Michael and Michelle, his beautiful twins, were growing fast. Janet, the love of his life, was happier than ever. But happiness is fragile. Sometimes, all it takes is a whisper. John was at work that day, flipping through reports, when Jackson leaned in, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "John, have you ever heard of Chief Martins?" John raised a brow. "The politician?" Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "No, not that one. A man in Lagos, raised 3 children for 30 years, only to find out, after a DNA test, that none of them were his." John frowned, the weight of the words settling on his chest. 30 years. Jackson nodded, stirring his coffee. "Yeah. Poor guy almost went mad. Imagine loving children that aren't even yours." John forced a laugh. "That's crazy." But as he returned to his work, a seed had been planted. A small, nagging thought. Doubt is a poison. It does not kill immediately, it spreads, consuming slowly, until nothing is left but suspicion. John tried to shake it off, reminding himself that Janet had been faithful, that their love was strong. But the thought lingered. Michael and Michelle, they were unidentical. That wasn't strange, was it? Some twins looked nothing alike. He turned to Janet, watching her peaceful face. Was he being paranoid? Or was Jackson right? The next morning, John did something he never thought he would do. "Jackson," he began hesitantly, "where did you do your children's DNA test?" Jackson smirked. "Oh, now you're thinking like a man. There's a place, very discreet. You don't have to tell Janet." John nodded, tension in his jaw. "I'll do it. But she must never know." And just like that, the foundation of his perfect home began to crack. What John did not know was that the truth had already been stolen from him. And the cost would be everything. Doubt is like a slow-moving storm, subtle at first, barely noticeable. Then, suddenly, it engulfs everything. John had spent the past week pretending nothing was wrong, but inside, his thoughts consumed him. Then came the call. "Hello, is this Mr. John Okeke?" John's breath hitched. "Yes." The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Your DNA results are ready. Would you like us to email them or would you prefer to come in?" John swallowed hard. His palms were sweating. "I'll come in." For some reason, the thought of seeing those results on a screen terrified him. The paper felt heavier than it should have. He unfolded it, eyes scanning the words, searching for reassurance. Then, his heart stopped. Probability of paternity, 0%. John read it again. And again. His vision blurred. "Doctor," his voice was barely above a whisper, this has to be a mistake." Dr. Edwin hesitated, but his expression remained unreadable. "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Okeke, but the results are conclusive." John's breathing grew uneven. The room tilted. He felt like the walls were closing in. He had loved those children from the moment they were born. He had waited for them, prayed for them. And now, they weren't his. When trust is broken, love doesn't disappear, it turns into something else. John didn't feel love in that moment. Only betrayal. "Janet." His voice thundered through the house. Janet stood quickly, her face etched with confusion. "John, what is it?" His eyes burned with fury. He pulled the paper from his pocket, shaking it in front of her. "Explain this." Janet took the document, her hands trembling. She read the words, but they made no sense. Her lips parted in shock. "John. I don't understand." John's jaw clenched. "Don't you dare lie to me." Tears filled her eyes. "John, I swear, I have never been with another man." But the fire in his eyes was too strong. In that moment, trust died. And so did the love that had once held their home together. The home that had once been filled with laughter became a battlefield. John's words were sharp. Accusations flew. Janet pleaded, but her voice was drowned in his rage. The twins clung to each other, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the shift. Janet collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. "John, please. I swear on my life. I have never betrayed you." But John wasn't listening. He was breaking. And so was she. Love is fragile. It can withstand storms, but only if the foundation is strong enough. John's home had been built on trust. But tonight, that trust had been shattered. Janet sat on the floor, her chest heaving with sobs. The paper lay crumpled beside her, the DNA test that had poisoned her marriage. "John, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I have never betrayed you." John's jaw tightened. "Then explain this." His voice was flat, emotionless. Janet looked up, tears blurring her vision. "I can't explain something I didn't do." The twins clung to each other on the couch, their innocent faces painted with fear. They didn't understand the words, but they felt the pain in the air. John didn't look at them. He couldn't. The love he had felt for them had turned into something else. Something dark. That night, Janet sat in her room, staring at a framed photo of happier times. John had always been her protector, her anchor. How had things fallen apart so quickly? She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number. "Mom," her voice cracked. "John doesn't believe me." On the other end, Mrs. Esther sighed heavily. "My daughter, the devil is at work. We will pray. But you must stand strong." "How, Mama?" "He won't even look at me." A pause. Then, in a soft voice, her mother said, "The truth will always come out. Hold on." Janet clung to those words like a lifeline. John didn't go home that night. Instead, he sat in his car, the echoes of Janet's voice ringing in his head. "I have never betrayed you." He wanted to believe her. But how could he? His best friend, Jackson, had been right. Or had he? Doubt warred with pain inside him, but the rage was stronger. He turned the key in the ignition, driving aimlessly into the night. The next morning, the house was silent. Janet prepared breakfast as usual, but John didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He simply sat at the table, eating in silence. The twins watched them carefully, sensing the change but too young to understand. Janet's heart ached. This wasn't her husband. This wasn't their home. But she still believed, somehow, she could fix it. What she didn't know was that the battle had only just begun. There are some wounds that words cannot heal. Days had passed since that night, but the house still carried the weight of betrayal. John no longer spoke to Janet. When he came home, he barely looked at her. His movements were mechanical: eat, sleep, work, repeat. Janet sat on the couch, staring blankly. She had begged, she had pleaded, but it was as if she no longer existed in John's world. The twins played on the floor, their innocent laughter a cruel contrast to the suffocating silence. Michael looked up at his mother. "Mommy, why are you sad?" Janet forced a smile, blinking away tears. "I'm not sad, baby." But Michael was only 4, not blind. News travels fast. The whispers had started. The women in the neighborhood spoke in hushed tones, throwing glances toward Janet's house. "I heard John found out the children aren't his," one woman murmured. "Ah." After 10 years of waiting, another gasped. "She must have been unfaithful," an older woman said, shaking her head. "Men don't behave like this without reason." And just like that, Janet's reputation was being torn apart. The weight of shame was unbearable. She had lost John's love. Now, she was losing her dignity. Janet couldn't take it anymore. She rushed to her mother's house, collapsing into her arms. "Mama, he doesn't believe me. He won't even look at me." Mrs. Esther held her daughter, stroking her hair gently. "My child, sometimes people believe what they want to believe." Janet sobbed harder. "I'm losing everything." Mrs. Esther sighed. "You must fight, my daughter. But if a man no longer trusts his wife, what is left?" Janet's breath hitched. The words cut deep. She had spent years fighting for this marriage. But was she the only one still holding on? That night, John met with Jackson. They sat at a bar, drinking in silence. Jackson finally spoke. "I told you, John. Women can't be trusted." John let out a bitter laugh. "I thought Janet was different." Jackson leaned in, his voice smooth and convincing. "Maybe it's time to move on." John said nothing. But something in his eyes shifted. The walls around his marriage were already crumbling. And now, he wasn't sure if he wanted to rebuild them. Some wounds never heal. They fester, deepening with time, until nothing is left but scars. Janet's home was no longer a place of love. It had become a house of silence, of empty stares and unspoken words. John entered the living room, barely looking at her. The man who once held her through the storms now treated her like a stranger. The twins sat on the floor, playing quietly, but they weren't laughing anymore. Michael finally broke the silence. "Daddy, will you play with us?" John's jaw tightened. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not today, son." And just like that, the last piece of warmth slipped through their fingers. Janet wasn't just losing her husband. She was losing herself. She sat on the bed, holding the tiny clothes Michael and Michelle had worn as newborns. How had they gotten here? She had never been unfaithful. She had never betrayed him. And yet, John looked at her as if she were the greatest mistake of his life. She clutched the fabric tighter, sobs racking her body. Would he ever believe her? Would she ever be enough again? Jackson had always been a snake. And now, he was striking. "You're still holding on to this mess, John?" Jackson scoffed, swirling his drink. "You deserve better." John exhaled, rubbing his temples. "She was my wife, Jackson." Jackson smirked. "Was." Past tense. He leaned in. "A real man doesn't waste his life on betrayal. Let her go." John swallowed hard. The thought had crossed his mind. Was Jackson right? Was it time to walk away? John sat in his car, staring at the house he no longer felt was his home. Janet's words echoed in his mind. "I never betrayed you." But the test said otherwise. He gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the wheel. His love for her still lingered, but his pride was louder. He reached for his phone. A divorce lawyer's number flashed on the screen. One call. That was all it would take. He inhaled sharply. Was this really the end? There comes a time when silence speaks louder than words. John didn't have to say it. His decision had already been made. He walked into the house past midnight. The living room was dimly lit, and there, on the couch, Janet sat waiting for him. "John," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He didn't answer. He didn't stop. He simply walked past her, his cold presence louder than any insult. Janet swallowed hard, feeling something inside her crack. Her marriage was slipping through her fingers, and she was powerless to stop it. Children don't need words to understand pain. Michael and Michelle were only 4, but they weren't blind. They sat on their bed, whispering. "Why doesn't Daddy talk to Mommy anymore?" Michelle asked, hugging her stuffed bear tightly. Michael shrugged, looking down at his fingers. "Maybe he's mad." Michelle's eyes welled with tears. "Did we do something wrong?" Michael shook his head. "I don't think so." They didn't understand betrayal. They didn't understand heartbreak. But they understood loneliness. And for the first time, they felt it creeping into their home. Janet had always been strong. But even the strongest people have limits. She stood in the bathroom, gripping the sink, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was not the same Janet who had once dreamed of a perfect family. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. She blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She had lost her husband. And now, she was losing herself. John thought it would be easy. But as he sat in his office, staring at the divorce papers, something inside him hesitated. All he had to do was sign. One stroke of the pen, and it would be over. No more pain. No more doubt. No more Janet. His fingers tightened around the pen. But for the first time in months, he felt something else. Regret. And it terrified him. There's a moment when a person stops fighting, not because they've lost the battle, but because they have nothing left to give. Janet sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small suitcase she had packed. She had spent years holding on. Holding on to love. Holding on to hope. Holding on to a man who no longer saw her. She turned to look at Michael and Michelle, sleeping peacefully. Tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't just leaving her husband. She was leaving a part of herself behind. She knew she couldn't face him. She didn't have the strength. Instead, she left a letter. John. I don't know when things changed. I don't know when you stopped loving me. I don't know when I became invisible to you. But I do know that I can't live like this anymore. I never betrayed you. But you never believed me. I hope one day, you find the truth. And I hope, when you do, it's not too late. Take care of our children. Goodbye. She placed the letter on the dining table. And with one final glance at the home she built, she walked away. John had spent months shutting Janet out. But the moment he realized she was truly gone, something inside him shattered. He walked into the house, his mind elsewhere, until he noticed the emptiness. The air felt different. He glanced toward the bedroom. The closet door was open. A suitcase was missing. His heart pounded. Then, he saw it. The letter. His hands shook as he picked it up, unfolding the paper. As he read, his breath hitched. His vision blurred. He hadn't cried in years. But tonight, tears fell. Regret is a slow poison. John had thought he was doing the right thing. He had convinced himself that Janet was guilty. But now, as he sat alone, holding the last words she had written to him, he felt something he never expected. Doubt. What if she had been telling the truth? What if he had thrown away the only woman who had ever truly loved him? His chest ached, the weight of his choices crushing him. For the first time, he wished he could go back. But some mistakes are unforgivable. A house is not a home without love. John had never realized how much of life's meaning was tied to Janet's presence until she was gone. The house felt empty. No soft laughter. No warm meals waiting. Just silence. Michael and Michelle sat on the floor, playing without energy. They didn't ask about their mother. But John knew. They felt her absence, just like he did. Children don't forget love. And they don't understand loss. One night, as John tucked them into bed, Michael spoke. "Daddy, when is Mommy coming home?" John's chest tightened. He looked away, his throat dry. Michelle hugged her bear. "Did we do something bad?" John swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart. Mommy, she just needed time." Michael frowned. "But we need her." John closed his eyes, guilt crashing over him. So did he. But what if she never came back? Regret is a heavy burden. John sat in his office, staring at nothing. Jackson had sent a message earlier. "You did what a real man should do. Don't look back." John exhaled sharply. For months, he had trusted Jackson's words. He had listened, let himself believe the worst about his wife. And now, Jackson had moved on. He had his own life, his own family. But John had nothing. And for the first time, he wondered. Had he been played? Janet didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had no choice. Her small apartment was quiet. Too quiet. She sat by the window, holding a framed photo of her family, her once perfect family. Michael and Michelle's smiling faces stared back at her. She ran her fingers over the glass. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered. Tears slipped down her face. Love doesn't just disappear. But sometimes, it's not enough to hold on. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Dr. Edwin Okafor sat in his office, his hands trembling as he stared at the phone in front of him. Months had passed since Janet left. Months of sleepless nights, haunted by the role he had played in destroying a family. But the news of her leaving, of her despair. It was too much. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed. "Mr. John," he began, his voice shaking. "We need to talk. It's about the DNA results. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried." John sat across from Dr. Edwin, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. "Are you telling me," John said slowly, his voice low and dangerous, "that the results were fake?" Dr. Edwin nodded, guilt written all over his face. "Jackson paid me," he admitted. "He wanted to ruin your marriage. I don't know why, but I didn't ask questions. I'm so sorry." John's chest heaved. His mind raced. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. Jackson. His best friend. The man he had trusted above all others. And Janet? He had destroyed her. For nothing. Betrayal is a knife that cuts both ways. John didn't waste time. He stormed into Jackson's home, his presence like a thunderstorm. "John," Jackson said, startled. "What's going on?" "You lied to me," John snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "You ruined my marriage. My family." Jackson's smirk faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." John grabbed him by the collar, his voice rising. "You paid the doctor to fake the DNA results. You destroyed everything." For the first time, Jackson looked afraid. And John. He had never felt so close to breaking. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about setting yourself free. John sat in his car, staring at a photo of Janet and the twins. The truth was out. But it didn't fix what he had broken. He wanted to see her. To tell her everything. But would she even listen? His fingers hovered over the car door handle. For the first time in months, he felt hope. But he also felt fear. Because some things can never be undone. There are moments in life that change everything. Janet sat in her small apartment, staring out the window, lost in thought. The past months had been heavy. She had rebuilt herself, or at least tried to. But the pain lingered. Then, a knock. Her heart skipped. She knew that knock. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Was she ready for this? Some wounds never truly heal. When Janet opened the door, she was met with a face she had once loved beyond reason. John stood there, eyes filled with emotions she couldn't read. For the first time in months, they were face to face. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Because how do you find words for a broken heart? The truth has a way of making its own way back. John exhaled, rubbing his palms together. "I was wrong," he said finally. Janet remained silent. He lifted his gaze, pain flashing in his eyes. "Jackson lied. The DNA test, it was fake." Janet's breath hitched. Her lips trembled, but she held herself still. She had dreamed of this moment. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure if it mattered anymore. Forgiveness is a choice. Janet stood, turning toward the window. John waited. For hope. For redemption. But she only whispered, "You destroyed me, John." His shoulders dropped. "I know." His voice cracked. "But I love you. I never stopped." Janet closed her eyes. She had waited so long to hear those words. But love was not the same as trust. And some things could never be repaired. Children may not understand the weight of adult problems, but they feel the shift when love disappears. Michael and Michelle sat on their bed, their toys forgotten. They had waited for their mother to return home. But when she did, something felt different. She wasn't the same. Daddy wasn't the same. And their little hearts ached in ways they didn't have words for. Some questions cut deeper than knives. Janet sat beside her children, brushing Michelle's hair. Michael looked up at her, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy, do you still love Daddy?" Janet froze. John stiffened from across the room. The room felt like it had lost all its air. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth was painful. She did love John. But love wasn't enough. Children cry in silence when they don't want to break what's already fragile. That night, Michelle lay in bed, hugging her teddy bear tightly. She didn't make a sound. She just let the tears fall. Because even at 4 years old, she knew. Something in their home had changed forever. A man can lose everything and still fight to rebuild. But when a man loses his family, sometimes, there's nothing left to fix. John stood by the doorway, watching his wife and children. But he wasn't a part of it. He was on the outside, looking in. And for the first time, he feared he would never belong there again. Some wounds heal with time. Others need more than an apology. John stood outside Janet's apartment, gripping a bouquet of flowers. For days, he had rehearsed what to say. But now, standing here, he realized there were no words strong enough to undo the past. Still, he knocked. Because trying was better than doing nothing. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength in its most painful form. Janet opened the door, her expression unreadable. She saw the flowers. The hesitation. The regret in his eyes. For a moment, she wanted to slam the door. But something, maybe love, maybe exhaustion, made her step aside. She let him in. Not because she had forgiven him, but because part of her still wanted to believe. Children don't care about betrayal. They care about love. Michael and Michelle had no idea what had happened between their parents. All they knew was that their daddy had been gone. And now, he was here. They ran to him, throwing their small arms around his waist. John dropped to his knees, hugging them tightly. Tears burned his eyes. He had failed as a husband. But he still had a chance to be their father. Some things cannot be rushed. Janet sat across from John, arms crossed. John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know, losing you was the biggest mistake of my life." Janet looked down. "John, I loved you with everything I had. And you threw me away." His throat tightened. "I believed a lie. And I paid the price for it." Silence stretched between them. The love was still there. But so was the damage. Could they ever fix what was broken? Love is not enough. Without trust, it crumbles. Janet sat across from John, her arms folded, her gaze unreadable. He had apologized. He had begged. But now, she asked the one question he wasn't prepared for. John, if Jackson never confessed, would you still believe I cheated? His breath caught in his throat. He had no answer. Because deep down, he wasn't sure. Guilt is heavier than betrayal. John sat in his car, staring blankly ahead. Janet's question echoed in his mind. He had spent years loving her. Months destroying her. And now, he was asking her to forget it all. Could he even be the man she needed anymore? Children don't need words to understand pain. Michael and Michelle sat at the dining table, eating quietly. Usually, Mommy smiled at Daddy. Usually, Daddy talked to Mommy. Now, they barely looked at each other. Michelle poked at her food. Daddy, are you staying with us now? John opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a journey. Janet stood by the window, arms crossed. She had loved John with everything she had. She had dreamed of growing old with him. But now, the love was still there. But the trust, it was shattered. And she didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Janet stood in the kitchen, making breakfast. John sat at the dining table, watching her. She hadn't asked him to leave. But she hadn't asked him to stay either. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't know where he belonged. Sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is yourself. John hadn't spoken to anyone about what happened. But tonight, he found himself at a bar, sitting across from Mr. Emmanuel, an old friend who had always been a voice of reason. You hurt her, John, Mr. Emmanuel said, sipping his drink. And now you expect her to just take you back. John exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I don't expect anything. I just don't know how to fix it. Mr. Emmanuel leaned in. Then stop trying to fix it. Start proving you've changed. John frowned. How? Mr. Emmanuel's gaze was steady. By being the man she needed before you broke her. Children don't understand betrayal. They only understand love. Michael and Michelle played on the floor, their laughter filling the room. Then Michael stopped, his little hands clutching a toy car. He looked up at Janet. Mommy, is Daddy going to stay with us forever now? Janet's breath hitched. She looked at John, who had frozen in place. Michelle tugged her mother's sleeve. Please, Mommy. We like it when Daddy is here. Janet forced a smile. But deep down, she didn't know if she had an answer. There comes a moment when love isn't enough. It has to be a choice. Janet sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her wedding ring. She had never taken it off. Not even after she left. But now, as she turned it between her fingers, she realized. This wasn't just about love. It was about trust. Could she ever trust John again? And if she couldn't, was love even worth it? Sometimes, love needs a little push. Michael and Michelle weren't old enough to understand everything. But they knew one thing. Mommy and Daddy were still broken. So they whispered together, making a plan. Crayons. Colored paper. A surprise that might just bring their family back together. Some words are too powerful to ignore. That night, Janet walked into her room and stopped. A piece of paper lay on her bed. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was a drawing, her, John, and the twins, holding hands. And beneath it, a message written in uneven, wobbly letters. "Mommy, Daddy, please love each other again." Tears welled in her eyes. Because sometimes, love wasn't about the past. It was about the future. Love isn't just a feeling. It is a commitment. Janet sat beside John, the letter still in her hands. "I don't know if I can forget," she whispered. John nodded. "I don't expect you to." She looked up at him, searching his eyes. "What do you expect, John?" He exhaled, gripping her hands. "I expect to spend the rest of my life proving I never should have doubted you." Tears slipped down her face. Because for the first time, she almost believed him. Some love stories have happy endings. Some don't. Janet stood there, her heart in conflict. John had changed. She could see it. But was it enough? She looked at the twins, their hopeful faces watching her. She looked at John, waiting for her choice. And for the first time, she didn't know if love was enough. Some choices shape the rest of our lives. Janet stood alone, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She read the words again. "Mommy, Daddy, please love each other again." Tears blurred her vision. She had never stopped loving John. But love alone was not enough. Trust had to be rebuilt. And the question was, could she take that risk? Regret is a slow-burning fire. And John had been burning for months. He sat in the living room, head in his hands. He had done everything he could. But what if it wasn't enough? What if he had lost her forever? The thought made his chest tighten. If Janet walked away, he wouldn't blame her. But he prayed she wouldn't. There is a moment before every life-changing choice. A moment where time stops. Janet stepped into the living room. John stood immediately. Their eyes met. And in that moment, the weight of their past, their love, their pain, it all hung between them. She took a deep breath. And finally, she spoke. "Love is a risk. Some take it. Some don't." Janet inhaled sharply, her heart pounding. "John," she whispered. His hands clenched. And then, she gave him her answer. "Some choices are made with the heart. Others, with the soul." Janet took a deep breath. She had spent months living in pain. She had spent years believing in love. Now, she had to decide. Which one would define her future? She looked John in the eyes. "I don't know if I can ever forget." John's jaw tightened. "But," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I want to try." Trust is not given. It is earned. John exhaled, his entire body trembling with relief. "Janet," he whispered. She held up a hand. "No promises, John." He nodded. "No promises. Just time." She swallowed hard. Time. That was all they had left. Love, in its purest form, is seen through the eyes of a child. Michael and Michelle had been watching. Waiting. Hoping. And when they saw their parents standing together, even without words, they knew. "Mommy!" Michelle shrieked, running forward. Michael grabbed John's hand. "Are you staying, Daddy?" John knelt, pulling them close. His voice shook. "Yes, buddy. I'm staying." Not all stories end in perfection. Some end in healing. That night, they sat at the table together. It wasn't perfect. The wounds were still fresh. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And sometimes, hope is all you need to start over. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried. Jackson had always been a man who thrived on destruction. He had watched John and Janet fall apart. Now, he had heard they were rebuilding. And that didn't sit well with him. So he came back. Forgiveness is not for everyone. Some men don't deserve it. John opened the door, and his entire body stiffened. Jackson stood there, his signature smirk in place. "Long time, brother," Jackson said smoothly. John's jaw clenched. Because this time, there would be no friendly conversation. Some wounds heal. Others are torn open again. Janet had spent months trying to forget Jackson's name, trying to erase his deception from her mind. But seeing him there, a chill ran through her. She wasn't ready for this. Not now. Not ever. Evil never apologizes. It just returns with new tricks. Jackson smirked. "You should thank me, John." John's fist clenched. "For what?" "For showing you the truth," Jackson said smoothly. "Or, what you thought was the truth." John took a step closer, his voice deadly. "Get out." Jackson chuckled, unfazed. "You really think this is over?" His smirk widened. "You have no idea what's coming. Some men don't seek redemption. They seek destruction." Jackson had lost the fight before. But a man like him never truly loses. Because his power wasn't in fists. It was in manipulation. And he had one last card to play. He dialed a number. The game wasn't over yet. Peace is fragile. And fear creeps in like a shadow. Janet held Michael and Michelle close, her heart pounding. She had seen Jackson's face. She had seen his smirk. And she knew. This wasn't over. John stood near the window, watching. Waiting. Because this time, he wouldn't let Jackson destroy them. Sometimes, justice is quiet. And sometimes, it is loud. John had spent too long letting Jackson dictate his life. So he found him first. He cornered him in an alley, his presence like a storm. Jackson laughed. "What, you gonna hit me?" John didn't flinch. "No," he said coldly. "I'm going to end this." And for the first time, Jackson looked afraid. Not all endings are perfect. But some are enough. Jackson was gone. Not just from their lives, but from their hearts. And as John and Janet sat together, watching their children play, not to apologize, but to finish what he started, they realized something. Love had been broken. But love had also rebuilt them. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. We want to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Who is to blame if they never reconciled? Who was at fault? What did you learn from this story? If you like this story and love watching videos like this, please hit the like button, share and subscribe to the True Stories Portal channel.